Very warm welcome to BBC News. My name is Mike Embley. Our top stories. Vladimir Putin's barred political rival lashes out. The president's supporters prepare to kickstart his election campaign. Pope calls for negotiations to end the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Investigators in Moscow are trying to find out why a bus ploughed into a subway entrance, killing at least 4 people. The Queen pays tribute to victims of terrorism as the royal family celebrates Christmas with its soon-to-be newest member. His main rival has been banned from running for the presidency, and later on Monday, supporters of Vladimir Putin will meet in Moscow to begin the process of nominating him as their candidate for president. The Russian leader won't even be attending that event. Some will see that as a sign that he's pretty confident. There's now very little standing in the way of his re-election in March. Virginia Langenberg explains.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
He's spent almost 18 years in power and is a man familiar with a grand entrance. But on this occasion, Vladimir Putin is expected to not even turn up to his own nomination event. Some have read into that decision as a sign of confidence, but the Kremlin says the Russian president has a prior engagement. Today marks the official launch of Mr. Putin's presidential campaign. He's running as an independent and has until the end of January to collect 300,000 signatures to register his bid. Little doubt the president will be re-elected. There are no strong rivals now that anti-corruption campaigner Alexei Navalny has been formally disqualified. The Central Electoral Commission deemed Mr. Navalny ineligible because of a corruption conviction, which is politically motivated.
It's not about me. It is about the fact that a candidate is needed who will finally come to the election and speak openly about everything that happens in our country now, who will describe our reality honestly. Absence of prospects, poverty. I did that, and that's why you don't want to let me take part in the election.
Following the ban, Navalny called on his supporters to boycott the election. But polls show President Vladimir Putin is on course for a comfortable re-election, meaning he'll remain in power for another 6 years, until 2024. Virginia Langenberg, BBC News.
Pope Francis has called for an end to the suffering of children and for peace in the Middle East. Christmas celebrations in Bethlehem have been quieter than usual after the violent unrest sparked by President Trump's decision to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital. This from our religion editor, Martin Bashir.
Bright sunshine lit up the Basilica in St. Peter's Square, but Pope Francis chose to focus his Christmas Day message on how conflict and oppression are casting a dark shadow over the world. Christmas makes us focus on the Christ child and thereby pay attention to the sufferings of children, particularly in the Holy Land. We see Jesus in the children of the Middle East, he said, who continue to suffer because of growing tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. On this festive day, let us ask the Lord for peace for Jerusalem. The Anglican Archbishop in Jerusalem, the Most Reverend Sohail Dawani, said that Christ himself wept over the city 2,000 years ago. And with Donald Trump's decision to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, that grief continues.
When he wept at that time, he wept for the absence of peace and love in the life of people who live here. I'm afraid that our Lord Jesus is really still weeping for this city.
Happy Christmas!
At Canterbury Cathedral, Archbishop Justin Welby said that though Christ was born without any political leverage, he provides more freedom to individuals than the world's most powerful leaders. But midway through preaching, his own powers of speech began to fail.
Unlike the budget, it's not gin.
In Rome, Canterbury and here in Jerusalem, Christian leaders have taken the opportunity of this day to challenge the wisdom of the world that they say puts power before people and has failed to protect the most vulnerable members of society, our children. Martin Bashir, BBC News in Jerusalem.
Russian investigators are trying to work out what caused a bus to career into a pedestrian subway in Moscow, killing at least 4 people. Victims include a woman in her 30s and a teenager. The driver told officials he'd been trying to apply the brakes, but they didn't work. Faith Orr reports.
It's a task nobody would envy. These emergency workers are picking up the pieces after a bus crashed into an underpass. It killed several people and was only stopped in its tracks by the tunnel's roof. This was the terrifying moment the vehicle barreled down steps, hitting pedestrians. Officials say they're working to try and establish what caused the crash.
The bus was driving away from the square and, due to unknown reasons, drove into a pedestrian underpass. The investigation is underway. As a result, 4 people died and 9 were hospitalised. 2 people refused to go to hospital. The driver is in shock now. The doctors and investigators are working with him, trying to figure out what happened.
The driver of the bus has been detained by police, but there's no suggestion this was terrorism. An inspection of the entire Moscow bus fleet has now been ordered. However it happened, it's a tragedy that will leave a scar on this city into the year to come. Faith Orr, BBC News.
Let's quickly round up some more of the main news for you. Protests have erupted in Peru over the president's decision to grant a medical pardon to the jailed former president, Alberto Fujimori. Hundreds of demonstrators took to the streets for a second day, accusing President Kaczynski of making a deal with the opposition to avoid his own impeachment. Fujimori was serving a 25-year sentence for human rights abuses, corruption and sanctioning death squads. Britain's Royal Navy has said there's been an increase in the number of Russian ships travelling through or near the UK's territorial waters over the holiday period. 2 vessels have passed close to UK water, areas of national interest, since Christmas Eve. Authorities in the Philippines have ordered a criminal investigation into a shopping mall fire in Mindanao. The fire started after a storm hit Davao and flooded parts of the city. At least 37 people died. The building's administrators have denied suggestions that emergency exits were inadequate. The deadly tropical storm that cut through the southern Philippines on Saturday, it killed 240 people, is now hitting southern Vietnam. Up to 1 million people are being evacuated from low-lying areas. Authorities are warning of up to 200 millimetres of rain. The tropical storm is weak, should dissipate within the next 48 hours. Nick Miller from the BBC Weather Centre gave us more details.
Thankfully, Tenbin, in terms of wind strength, has weakened, downgraded from a typhoon to a tropical storm. That weakening will continue over the next few days. You can see on the satellite pictures to southern Vietnam, cloud just starting to break apart a bit, an indication of the weakening of this system, but it is still a big rainmaker and still for a little while longer into southern Vietnam, that heavy rain. And then the energy from Tenbin moves into the Gulf of Thailand on towards southern Thailand in the coming days, may also bring some rain into Bangkok. And for land areas still in the path of Tenbin, still the risk of up to 200 millimetres of rain from it. So the flooding and landslide threat absolutely continuing for a while longer yet. And as I mentioned, southern Vietnam, next in the path, southern Thailand.
Nick Miller for us there. Queen Elizabeth has been attending the traditional Christmas Day service along with other members of the royal family, including Prince Harry and his fiancée Meghan Markle. In her Christmas Day broadcast, the Queen paid tribute to the cities of Manchester and London for the way they dealt with this year's terrorist attacks. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell has more.
It's a day for family, with its own established pattern. For the royal family, that means a visit to church, led by the Queen. And there, very much at home already, the royal family's soon-to-be newest member, Meghan Markle. Alert to everything that was going on, and waiting for her cue in terms of royal protocol. A neat curtsy as the Queen left by car. And then walking across to speak to members of the crowd who'd been hoping to meet her, before lunch, and then the Queen's Christmas broadcast. The central message of this year's broadcast was one of solidarity with 2 British cities.
This Christmas, I think of London and Manchester, whose powerful identities shone through over the past 12 months in the face of appalling attacks.
The Queen said it had been a privilege to witness the extraordinary bravery of young people injured in the Manchester attack.
Very wicked. And, to target that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes.
She spoke too about what she called the sheer awfulness of the Grenfell Tower fire.
Our thoughts and prayers are with all those who died and those who lost so much. And we are indebted to members of the emergency services who risked their own lives this past year, saving others.
Television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day.
And there were personal touches. The Queen recalled that it's 60 years since she delivered the first live Christmas Day TV broadcast.
And that is how I imagine you now.
6 decades on, the presenter has evolved somewhat.
And it's 70 since she and the Duke of Edinburgh were married. He retired from solo duties this year, but
I know his support and unique sense of humour will remain as strong as ever, as we enjoy spending time this Christmas with our family, and look forward to welcoming new members into it next year.
A Christmas message which acknowledges the passage of time, but which reminds us that more than 6 decades now after she came to the throne, the Queen remains strongly committed to her role as head of state. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News at Buckingham Palace.
A diplomatic row between Venezuela and Canada has intensified. Canada is banning Venezuela's ambassador from returning to Ottawa and expelling its chargé d'affaires. Canada's foreign minister said it's retaliation for the expulsion of its most senior diplomat from Caracas over the weekend. Leonardo Rocha, America's editor for BBC World Service, gave us more analysis.
And Venezuela have been at odds for a few months, and Canada has been supporting to some extent the opposition, which in Venezuela is protesting against the lack of democracy and what they say is human rights violations. What Canada said is a very strong statement. They said Canadians would not stand by as the government of Venezuela robbed its people of their fundamental democratic and human rights. Also on Tuesday, Venezuela expelled the Brazilian ambassador. So what I believe is happening here is Venezuela is making a clear stance and they giving a strong message to those who criticize the government of President Nicolás Maduro. We're not going to listen quietly, we're going to act. And in the meantime, they're releasing 80 political prisoners, 80 opposition activists in Venezuela. All that comes probably months before the presidential election, which is expected to take place in the first half of next year.
So how far do you think all this is going to go, I mean, diplomatically?
I think relations between, in trade terms and economic terms with Canada are not for Venezuela. What really matters for Venezuela are relations with its allies, mainly Russia, also Cuba, with other countries in the region that support Venezuela, like Bolivia, and the United States, selling oil to the United States. The economy is in trouble. Inflation is completely out of control, and it's a political message from the government of President Nicolás Maduro. The Canadian government has responded back. And what Venezuela has been saying, that they are taking orders from the Trump administration. It's more of the same from the Venezuelan government, making a clear stance that they are not going to take abuse. At the same time, they have a very weakened internal opposition with many leaders in jail or having escaped the country, with the prospect of President Nicolás Maduro probably in April, May next year, running for another 6-year term and securing another term.
Leonardo Rocha, America's editor for BBC World Service. Much more to come on BBC News, including this: the world's top wingsuit flyers in their jaw-dropping bid for the world title. Very good to have you with us on BBC News. The latest headlines for you: Vladimir Putin's election rival is barred from running as the president's supporters prepare officially to launch his campaign. The Pope has been giving his Christmas blessing. He called for peace for Jerusalem and mutual trust on the Korean Peninsula. Well, China has called for all countries to make constructive efforts to ease tensions on the peninsula. North Korea said the latest UN sanctions against it are an act of war and tantamount to a complete economic blockade. Pyongyang has vowed to strengthen its nuclear deterrent. South Korea's defense ministry, meanwhile, is launching a special team on North Korea, an attempt at responding more effectively to increased threats from its northern neighbour. Let's speak to Jacob Shapiro, Director of Analysis for intelligence firm Geopolitical. He's in Hot Springs, Virginia now. Thanks very much for your time. That description of the latest UN sanctions as an act of war, are they, do you think, or will they have that effect?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and Merry Christmas. If you look at every piece of rhetoric out of North Korea, every statement, it's all about nuclear war or impending mass destruction. I think this is all an effort by North Korea to make everyone extremely afraid of them, and I think they've done a very good job at that. Ultimately, no, I don't think that North Korea is about to launch nuclear war on the world, and certainly they're not going to let a little thing like further UN sanctions drive them to that step.
The assumption generally is that the North Korean leadership is not suicidal. It doesn't want to start a war, but it's clearly not going to give up its nukes either. Is it? How does this?
Very logical. I think the calculation that they've made is that nobody is going to come and take from them, and that even if somebody comes and tries, they will be able to endure. So yes, I think that ultimately the world is going to have to get used to a nuclear North Korea. I will say that I'm not sure that a world with a nuclear North Korea is that different from a world with a non-nuclear North Korea. If North Korea used nuclear weapons, the United States would obliterate it the next day. So ultimately, I think this is all a way for North Korea to try and use leverage to get what they ultimately want, which is reunification of the Korean Peninsula under their terms.
Yeah, it seems almost a bizarre thing to say, given the weapons involved and the millions already suffering and the millions of people at risk. In a sense, though, in this region, North Korea is a sideshow, really, isn't it?
I think it is a sideshow. I think it's used by foreign powers to play against each other. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, it was really a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, and China got involved. I think some of the same dynamics are happening. You see the conflict between China and the United States playing out in North Korea. You see Russia trying to play around there in order to cause the United States problems, and then the United States responding in kind by selling anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. And I think ultimately, when you think about the larger importance of this, it is that the U.S., increasingly more self-absorbed, is pulling back from the region, and we're going to see Japan and China competing more and more for regional power, and that may play out on the Korean Peninsula.
How do you expect that competition to play out?
Well, I think that competition is already playing out. If you look at China's One Belt, One Road initiatives, you can find Japanese investments in all those countries as well. If you look at all of the defense relationships that China is trying to establish, you see Japan there as well. You see them also competing in Central Asia. I don't see this reaching a military conflict anytime soon, but I think around the periphery, you will see different powers competing, and I think ultimately they will try to constrain North Korea to keep this problem in North Korea. This is the worst for the Chinese, because if a major war does develop there, they have to worry about millions of North Koreans streaming over the borders, and they don't want that.
Jacob Shapiro of Geopolitical Futures, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Vitaly Mutko is stepping down temporarily as the country's football official. He says he wants to concentrate on contesting a lifetime ban from the Olympic Games as over state-sponsored doping. He will remain as chief organizer of next year's World Cup in Russia.
Today, using the opportunity I have, I addressed the Russian Football Union's executive board in regard to the temporary impossibility of performing my duties while court proceedings are underway. This is in order to let the Russian Football Union work normally. I asked that my full powers be temporarily suspended for up to 6 months. I didn't resign. My mandate will be active until 2020.
Vitaly Mutko there. A huge rock slide has cut off a community near Innsbruck in Austria. This was the main road into the village. Just 10 minutes before this, local people were using it to get to church for Christmas Mass. As you can imagine, this road is unlikely to be cleared until Wednesday. In the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, each year around 2,000 women are killed over dowry demands. But an 80-year-old grandmother has been waging a unique fight for gender equality. Prakashi Tomar is India's oldest shooting champion. Here's her story.
मेरा नाम प्रकाशी तोमर है। उम्र मेरी 80 साल की हो गई। 60 साल की उम्र में मैंने पिस्टल उठाई थी। लोगों ने ही वो दादी शूटर रिवॉल्वर दादी शूटर ये भी जिक्र हो गया था जब लड़की भी शादी करेंगे दहेज भी नहीं मांगने के डरी आई तो दादी शूटर हैं बंदूक मार देंगे। कभी स्कूल में दिन जाके देखा किसी ने पढ़ाई नहीं और यहाँ का कुछ भी नहीं सोचा बस अपना ये घर का काम घेर का काम खेत का काम यही करे थे। ये जो उस उम्र में लगन लगी जिस उम्र में आदमी दो टहल करके खाट देखे आराम की जरूरत है हमने वह लगन ठीक करी ऐसे टाइम पे उसमें थोड़ी अपनी पहचान बनाई। बस ये देखो साइड टारगेट को छोड़ दो साइड को देखो भी तो बहुत अच्छा होगा। कुछ दिन तो 2-4 दिन तो बैठ के देखा फिर वो कहने लगे अम्मा एक छर्रा मार के देखो भर के मारा वो सही लगा। कोच कहना दादी आप तो बहुत अच्छा करोगी आप करा करो शूटिंग। अरे बुढ़िया हो रही लोग हमारी मजाक उड़ाओगे। फिर लोग मजाक करने लगे।
दादी को देखकर लगता है कि जब दादी कर सकती है तो हम क्यों नहीं कर सकते। दादी ने शूटिंग करवाने के बाद मतलब फिर मुझे मोटिवेट
Prakashi Tomar, not to be messed with. If you've enjoyed a day of festive excess, eating and drinking, possibly a little too much, perhaps the most exercise you want right now is reaching for the remote. So spare a thought for competitors in the Wingsuit Flying World Cup. They spent most of their Christmas jumping out of planes or balloons in China at Qinggu in Yunnan province. As the BBC's Tim Orman explains.
You know what they say? What goes up must come down. A principle they understand all too well at the Wingsuit Flying World Cup. Teams from around the globe, extreme and somewhat hair-raising sport.
I travelled more than 400 kilometres to see this. We arrived here early in the morning just to watch the wingsuit flying show. It's spectacular.
You can say that again. A couple of skydivers performed a 360-degree rotating nosedive, while others piggybacked on their teammates. But not everyone was happy with how things turned out.
I think our performance this time didn't reflect our real strength. We'll get to our best through regular competition. I hope we perform better next time.
The Chinese team finished third overall behind the winners France and the United States, who came second. It's a non-profit event and a local school received a cheque worth more than $30,000. So some charitable spirit combined with a little heart-stopping terror. How can you get more festive than that? Tim Allman, BBC News.
Some of you may be enjoying a white Christmas this year. There's also been some unexpected snow in parts of the US. This was the scene in Maine, where they got quite a coating. City workers were called in from their holidays to help grit the streets. In Portland, Oregon, icy road conditions caused some traffic problems. A rare inch of snow recorded here. Much more on all this anytime on the BBC website. You can reach me and most of the team on Twitter. Thanks for watching.